Hello and welcome to part 3 of the Crepe tutorial. Today we'll be looking specifically at unwrapping. If you've never unwrapped before, I'd suggest that you first have a look at the introduction to unwrapping video. This will give you a basic introduction to what we're going to be doing, and will make this video much easier to follow. So what we're specifically be doing, we're going to be unwrapping the main Crepe object and the slat object. We're also going to be duplicating this slat object around using a tool called duplicate with transform, which we'll be going through in a short while. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this slat forward, okay, and I'm going to make my selection. In this case I'm going to use face. Face is nearly always the easiest selection to make, and it's the most reliable when it comes to then assigning a projection to that selection, so that's why we pretty much always use face. Now in this instance we're going to be using the planar projection. Now some of you will click this and you will get something that looks like this. Alright, that's not a problem. You might even end up with something that looks like this. If this happens, we can just change this to 90, and we can use the manipulation handles to just grow that UV or grow that projection over the object. So as long as you end up with something like this, we can open up the UV editor and we should see that we have a nice representation now of our object. Now in the UV I'm going to hold right click and I'm going to select the UV selection type. This is the selection type that we have to use in order to get things like smooth and other tools to work. There is another UV selection called UV shell, which will select the entire UV shell but won't allow us to necessarily apply any tools. Now the UV selection works the same as pretty much all the other selections. If we double click an object, it will select every point on that object. If we drag select, it's the same dealio, so it doesn't matter how we do it, it works the same as the other selection types. Once we've made the selection in the UV, we're going to come to Tools and we're going to come to Smooth. Now when I click on Smooth, I'm going to get two boxes at the bottom here. I'm going to get Unfold and I'm going to get Relax. We don't want to use Relax because if we use Relax it's going to screw up the unwrap. What we want to use is Unfold, and if I drag this to the right you'll notice that my flaps start to appear, and I have a pretty decent slat unwrap. Now you'll notice that some of these points aren't massively straight. Okay, and that's because Smooth doesn't always work that well when we're working with diagonal objects. There could also be other things going on here. Now there is a tool in Maya called Straighten UVs, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to rotate this by maybe 45 degrees, something like that, and I'm just going to go to Modify with my UV still selected, and I'm going to click on Straighten UVs. And what that will do is it will just sort out the wonky UVs here, and hopefully give me a decent unwrap. The reason why I say hopefully is because occasionally when you've unwrapped and you straighten, it doesn't respect the kind of the smooth operation you've just done. In some instances you might find that you actually have to kind of toggle between unfolding and then straightening UVs just to make sure that you get a decent representation of your 3D shape. Okay, so that's it for the slat. We don't have to do anything else now in terms of unwrapping for the slat. What we do have to do is duplicate. Now I mentioned previously in other videos that there are two types of duplicate. We have Control D, which is just your bog standard duplicate. You'll notice as I move and press Control D, I'm having to move each individual section independently. Now there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. This is what most people will use all of the time. However, in this instance we want to use duplicate with transforms. This is going to save us a lot of time, it's also going to save us a lot of hassle, but let me show you what it does. So if I press Shift D on this object, exactly the same as Control D in this instance, but if I move it and then press Shift D again, it actually remembers the transform and will duplicate that object with the specific transform. Now this might have absolutely no use within this application that I've just demonstrated, but if we slot this in place and we press Shift D and we move and we rotate this with angle snaps on, otherwise we'll be there forever, and I position this roughly where I want it, somewhere about there should do, and I press Shift D again, you'll notice that it's going to move it round the other side, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now we also want to put slats on the top and the bottom, but of course Shift D isn't going to help us here, so we're going to return to Control D. So I'm going to select this object, I'm just going to rotate it by 90 degrees, and I'm going to position this on the top, and then I'm going to press Control D again, and we'll do the same on the bottom. Now some of you might want to use perhaps more customized slat designs, that's absolutely fine. If that's what you want to do, feel free to duplicate them as you please and come up with your own patterns. The only thing I would say, one of the most common patterns that I see in my sessions is kind of the crisscross pattern, something that looks like this. Okay, and this does look awesome. Certainly if it's more stylized, it does look really, really cool. It's worth noting, however, that if we keep these two slats where they are, in this diamond in the middle, in engine, we might well end up with something called Z fighting. Now, Z fighting happens when you have two polygons or two groups of polygons that occupy the same space, and the renderer can't tell which one comes first. Now, you've probably seen this in games before, where you're walking, usually transition material between kind of like a brick or like a concrete material into grass, and where they actually overlap, you can end up with some sort of weird glitching where you move and 1 minute it's grass, the next minute it's stone or concrete or whatever the other material is, and that's essentially Z fighting in a nutshell. Now we can fix this really simply just by dragging one of the slats behind the other, ever so slightly. It really won't make much difference when you're looking at it as an object, but it will mean that you don't get any Z fighting. Now, I'm not particularly interested in having crisscrosses. I just want one slat on each side. But what I do like is to make sure that all of my slats sort of flow, so I kind of create almost like a zigzag. And I also like the top and the bottom to kind of create this weird triangle pattern. I just think it looks nicer. As I say, however you do the slats is sort of up to you, and this is just how I like to do them. But that's it. Once we have a slat on each face, once you finish customizing your slat designs, we can move on to the crate. Now, with the crate, this is a bit more complex because we are actually going to unwrap this in two parts. The first part's going to deal with the central section, so pretty much all of the polygons around the center from this top edge here to this bottom edge here, and then finally the top and the bottom will unwrap separately. Now, the reason why we're going to do this is because the top and the bottom are on a completely different axes to the faces around the middle. Later on, as we progress, you'll notice that essentially every time a smoothing group changes, you want to have a different UV island. Now, we don't have smoothing groups. Well, we do have smoothing groups, the automatic ones that are applied, but we haven't put any on here. All we need to know for now is that if it's on a different face, if it's on a different axis, the chances of us being able to unwrap it properly are pretty slim. In any case, this is the easiest way to unwrap it. So I'm going to select the crate material. I'm going to hold Alt and press H. This is going to select everything that is not selected. And then I'm going to make my selection. Now, I'm not going to select each of these faces individually, but what I am going to do is I'm going to select all of the central sections, and then I'm going to use the Grow tool. Now, the shortcut key for Grow selected is if we hold Shift on the keyboard and press the greater than key, or the full stop key, twice, we should then end up with a full selection here. Now, this is what I meant by selecting all of the faces between this edge and this edge around the crate. We don't want to select the top and the bottom because we're going to use cylindrical here. Cylindrical doesn't actually have any projection at the top or the bottom, so you'll just end up with a line of polys that can be a pain to relax. Once we've made the selection, we can actually use cylindrical. Now, you'll notice that it applies the cylindrical projection type. What I'd like to do now is just open up the UV editor. Okay, so hopefully we can see that this is not what we're looking for. Now, I can tell you what's happening here. Whenever we unwrap, whenever we apply a projection, Maya, 3ds Max, every 3D modeling program that you're going to use essentially tries to work out where a seam is going to start and end. Now, we can see from this that in this particular instance, it's taken one of these diagonal edges and one of these diagonal edges. It's gone into the center here, up one of these vertical edges, and then back out across the top. So we've actually got one of these polygons and one of these polygons as kind of like the two polygons of the of this seam. Now, this might not seem like a problem, but if we were trying to paint a material between these two faces and they were on the opposite sides of the unwrap, it becomes quite tough for us to gauge how to make that tile. As a general rule of thumb, we want that seam to be where kind of the face changes or the smoothing group changes, because this is a natural break in the material, usually. Now, in order for us to achieve this, we're actually going to have to rotate that cylindrical projection, and as we're doing this, we're saying move that seam, essentially. Now, we can rotate this particular cylindrical projection by using these two red dashes here. And if I hold left click on one of these and I rotate it to the right, you'll notice it rotates. And if we have a look in the UV editor shortly, it will pop. And that's what we're looking for. Okay, so let me show you again. We're looking for that. A nice square unwrap. Now we know that this is using one of these corner edges for the scene because we have nice straight edges here. Now not only does this make texturing easier, this also makes the relaxing easier. So once we've got this, we can press W just to finish off the operation. And I'm going to hold right click and select UV, and I'm just going to select this whole selection here. And I'm going to come to Tools, and I'm going to come to Smooth, and I'm going to drag this unfold tool to the right here until I end up with something that roughly resembles a crate. Now occasionally you'll find that Smooth, for whatever reason, doesn't do a particularly great job. Okay. In this instance, we can keep that selection, we can open up Modify, and we can use Unfold. Okay. Unfold nearly always will fix these kind of problems. You can, if you like, just use Unfold. You don't have to use Smooth at all. I find that Smooth gives you a little bit more control over the relax. Sometimes you don't necessarily want to fully relax something. Sometimes you want to kind of like half relax it. Unfold will basically give you the end goal, so to speak. Now we've got the same problem here that we had with the slat. It's not particularly straight. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to rotate this, get it as straight as possible. And then what we can do once we get something like this is we can come to Modify and Straighten UVs. Okay, and that will sort that problem out. So now we have nice straight central UVs. But we do still have some faces that are not in the UV. We have this top face and this bottom face, and we're going to go through exactly the same process. So we're going to select both of the central polygons there, and we're going to grow twice. So what we've got is exact opposite of what we did have. Okay, we could also have selected what we have in the UV here. We could have selected this and selected the inverse, but in this instance I think this is probably the best option. So we've made the selection, we're then going to make the projection. Same problem that we had previously, the projection is in the wrong axes. In this instance we need to change these zeros to 90, okay, and that will give us our projection. Now it's worth noting at this point that we're going to end up with something called flipped faces. Now we know this because the planar projection is going to be looking through this top polygon, and it's going to see the front face here as we can see it. It's then going to continue on through that front polygon, and it's going to see the back faces of the bottom polygons. Now this doesn't really make this doesn't cause any trouble. We can still unwrap this way, we can still relax this way, but it's worth noting that if we don't fix this in the UV, anything we apply to these faces here will be flipped, almost like in a mirror. If I type my name here, it would appear backwards. So it is important that we keep check. Now if I come to the unwrap editor again, I have a pretty good selection here of my faces, and I'm just going to, in this instance, instead of going to UV, I'm going to change to UV shell. Because even though we've only got one UV here, we know there are two, okay, but they're stacked. Now occasionally, and often, stacking UVs is actually a technique for saving UV space. If you have any particular objects that are going to use the same material, are not really going to be massively distinguishable, then stacking them actually is a really good way of working, because it means that you don't have to create that material more than once, and you've got more UV space to focus on the textures that a player is actually going to see. And again, with the crate, this is not necessarily going to be a big issue, but certainly with things like firearms, cars, big objects that have lots and lots of different kind of models applied to them and then grouped together, they certainly will have lots of stacked UVs, and this is something that we want. The downside of stacked UVs, however, is that the material that you apply to one is applied to all of them. You also as well might have trouble when baking. If you're going to be using Substance Painter later on, and you're going to be baking in Substance Painter, again, if you're stacking the UVs and they're in different positions, you might find that you end up with different lighting information on each one. Now I'm not going to go too much into detail as to why, but there will be a video later on where we look at why stacking UVs is good and also why sometimes stacking UVs is bad. So we need to separate this stack, and I'm just going to left click on this top UV and I'm just going to drag this. Now which one is flipped? There's no easy way of knowing in the UV editor. We obviously could look in the 3D viewer and we know that it's going to be the bottom one that's flipped. But this is quite a simple object. We have that option, we can look, but it's nearly always easier to allow Maya to tell us. Now if we come to select at the top here and we click back facing, Maya will actually select the polygon that is backwards. Once we find this out, we can deselect and reselect. The reason why we deselect and reselect is because occasionally when you select back facing, you might find, in this instance it hasn't done it, but you might find, certainly in your example, that where we've got some of these edges here that are hidden, some of these faces here that are hidden, it will see those as back faces. And if we keep the selection and we flip the selection, we're going to end up with this being on top of this, and the two edges or the three edges that are not relaxed here will end up on the right hand side. So that's why we deselect and reselect. We can then come to modify and flip, and then we can just double check that all of those faces are back the way they should be. Now you notice when we flipped you didn't see anything, and that's because this object literally just did it just flipped on the spot, and that's why when we come to select and we do back facing, that's just a good check to make sure that everything is the way it should be. So now we need to relax these two shells, and we're going to do this by selecting UV, modify, tools, and smooth, and we're just going to drag unfold, and we do the same over here. Alright, awesome, and that's it for the relaxing. So now I'm going to introduce you to something called stitching. We've already looked at the idea of having seams, and being able to paint materials across seams is very, very important. And the top and the bottom are no real different. We could leave them if we wanted to not attached, and that's fine. But if we want to paint things like blood splatters or burn marks or rising damp or any of the above, it could be anything that you wanted. If you wanted to paint these things on here, knowing where something tiles can really help to kind of work out how to paint a material across a seam that's not connected. So what we're going to try and do here is we're going to attach the top and the bottom polygons to this main unwrap using a tool called Stitch to, or Move and Sew. So I'm going to select this top edge, and I'm going to select the edge I want to stitch to, and I'm going to come to Cut and Sew, and I'm going to click on Move and Sew, and that's going to move that here. Don't worry if it kind of ruins up this particular unwrap. We are going to smooth this, and that will fix that problem. We're then also going to click the edge we want to stitch to at the bottom. We're going to come to Cut and Sew, and we're going to Move and Sew here. And once we've done this, that's pretty much it. All we need to do now is select UV, double click the object, come to Tools, Smooth, and we can relax that. Again, if it doesn't work, we can come to Modify and Unfold, and Modify and Straighten Edges, and that will solve those problems. Okay, now the next step is to attach the crate and the slats together. Now you notice I've been dragging stuff off the grid, and this is because when we attach objects together, if I select one of these other objects, you'll notice that the UVs kind of have their own space. So this shell will appear here, and this shell will appear here. But often what happens is that if we leave them in the grid or we leave them in the same place, when we attach them, they end up kind of appearing over each other. This is really easy to fix if it happens. This is not really something that is a big issue, but sometimes it can just help. If you just keep a track of where they are, it means certainly for complex objects you're not having to spend 3 or 4 minutes moving UVs around in order to kind of separate them out. So just knowing where the other one is helps, because when we attach these two objects together, or these 7 objects together, they're going to appear in the same unwrap. Okay. So the last step of this video is actually going to be using a tool called Combine, and this will allow us to attach each one of these faces together so that we can pack in the next video. Now I'm going to select every object that I want to combine, so that's everything. I'm going to come to Mesh. Remember, within Mesh we're going to find all of the big modifiers, the big stuff, Booleans, combine, separate, those kinds of things, and I'm going to click Combine. And when I do that, you'll notice that if I deselect and reselect, I'm selecting all of these objects now. And if I come to the Unwrap editor, you'll notice that we have 2 shells instead of 1. Now that pretty much concludes this part 3 of the video. In the next part we're going to be looking at how we can pack these UVs and how we can render these UVs. I hope this video has been useful. If it hasn't, or you want me to do something different, just let me know in the comments below. Thank you very much.